Hey guys, Jason here, back with another TCG extended deck profile. Today's feature deck is Liquid People Beatdown. We're back to our mono water roots, and are rocking this shiny new toy, well, not literally, from DM13 Pacific Champion. It's another one of my favorite cards from the set, and its effect states it cannot be attacked or blocked by non-evolution creatures. It's a very powerful effect, and it was the true MVP of mono water back in the early OCG days. While our format probably has more evolutions than most, it's still a really good effect, especially given the cost. In the OCG, Pacific Champion was a devastating card and was a key player for several formats after its release, so much so it was even Hall of Famed for a while. This deck won't have the same level of power in Season 3 as it did in the OCG, because we are choosing not to include Fist Blader in the card pool. It's literally a Merfolk Aqua Guard, but because it was released in a pre-constructed deck, I don't think we would have gotten it in the TCG, even if we did get DM13. But maybe it's for the best. So I'm just gonna talk about Pacific Champion some more. I think we tackled a lot of the key points at the start of the video. I feel like this card takes the best elements of Spin Slicer and Hydrus when we consider the cost and power, and merges them into one card. The drawback is that it's a little harder to support, especially without Fist Blader, but I think we have just enough to make it work. It's actually not broken, since it can still get removed by Terror Pit, Apocalypse Vice, and most notably Soul Swap, which can be casted as early as turn 3. But I do still think it's a great card, and it can secure victories in otherwise unwinnable situations. So, to support Pacific Champion, we've got 4 copies of Time Scout, and 4 copies of William Y. Carpenter. Just kidding, just Wiley Carpenter. So, more often than not, we will be prioritizing Liquid People over Merfolk, because we just have more Liquid People. However, this still largely depends on how we map out our turns based on the available cards. Time Scout is probably the best Evo bait, since it is the cheapest and has no drawback effect. The effect is really funny, but not particularly useful, since there's usually not much we can do with the information anyway. Wiley Carpenter, I don't want to say is a problem child, but is really just here because there isn't anyone better to use. It's usually bad to play it on curve, unless we can guarantee a Pacific the following turn, since we won't be holding many cards, and Wiley will probably end up dumping the cards we draw. However, it can come in clutch late game, especially if we're sitting at 5 mana or more. If we're holding at least 1 card, Wiley Carpenter lets us dig for our evolutions and squeeze out an extra attacker, and this particular interaction has actually decided a lot of games. We also considered cutting down from 4 to 3 copies of Wiley Carpenter, but that made Pacific Champion too inconsistent, so we stayed at 4. Moving on to the Liquid People section, we've got 4 copies of Aqua Guard and 4 copies of Crystal Spin Slicer. These are the poster boys of Mono Water Rush. You need this lineup, and it is your best turn 1 into turn 2 play. Even if you don't open with them though, it also only costs 3 to play Spin Slicer as a speed attacker with this combo, so if you don't draw the cards in the desired order, the mana efficiency ends up still being really helpful. Being so cheap also means we aren't too bothered by breaking into bounce early like Aqua Surfer or Spiral Gate in Shields, because we can just play it again the following turn. And where there are Liquid People, there is Aqua Hulkus, or 4 Aqua Hulkus to be specific. It feels really good to play this card on turn 3, and it is one of the few true advantage generating cards in the deck. We also have 2 Aqua Vehicle, and I think these guys are more important than they seem. They are additional Evo bait for Spin Slicer, since Aqua Guard is the only other super cheap Evo bait. And it also helps, I guess, that it can function as a 2-drop attacker, even though it's not particularly impressive. I will say, though, that having a 2-drop attacker is still pretty good, because many of the slower decks in the format start playing their cards at around turn 3. So if you go first and open with a 2-drop, you're actually off to a really good start. Now, we just talked about advantage generating cards, and, well, speaking of which, we've got 4 copies of Lucky Ball. This is an aggressive water deck, so this card is a no-brainer. In hindsight, this definitely should have been in the original Mono Water list from Season 1, But this card wasn't on our radar at the time for some reason, and we were also being a little silly with the T-Dad gimmicks. Being able to attack with Spin Slicer as early as turn 2 or 3 is actually huge for Lucky Ball. If you think about it, if you're able to Spin Slicer on 2 and then attack twice, you can Lucky Ball on curve. Also, if you open with a 2-drop and then you play a Speed Attacker Spin Slicer on 3, you can swing twice on 3, and then you can play Lucky Ball on 4. Now, these situations aren't particularly likely, but I think it's really cool that the option's there. Aside from that, Lucky Ball is also one of our most frequently prayed for top decks. It's just at the mid to late point of the game, we might start running out of steam, but then this dude just grabs us a whole lot of momentum. Lucky Ball also has great synergy with Wily Carpenter. Usually, I feel like Carpenter is not very good when you have a few cards in your hand because you aren't able to manage resources properly. More often than not, you just draw cards off Wily Carpenter and then you just dump the cards you draw. But with a larger hand size from Lucky Ball, you have more options to decide between and can map out subsequent plays much better. We've also got 4 copies of Spiral Gate and 4 copies of Aqua Surfer. We need these bouncy bounce cards in the deck. They are very important. We actually don't have Emerald in this deck, which hurts the consistency a little bit, especially for Aqua Surfer. But because I needed to make space for all of the true merfolks, unfortunately Emerald had to be cut. Now, these are the only trigs we run, but they are defensive trigs, which is nice. Spiral Gate is hard casted very often. Sometimes we Spiral Gate on 2 or 3, and then so we can protect our 2-drop attacker, swing for shields, and then unlock Lucky Ball. Other than that, we also just play Spiral Gate for general Spiral Gate things. Damien will be happy. Aqua Surfer is played probably the least out of all of the cards I've talked about thus far, unless it's in our shields, because, well, it's pretty expensive. But yeah, Aqua Surfer is just great at doing Aqua Surfer things, and he can, if our opponent breaks into him early, that can cause a reversal and win the game. You know the drill. To finish off the deck, we've got 1 copy of Crystal Paladin and 1 copy of Teleportation. These are the tech cards of the deck. For a while, we were running 2 Paladin and 0 Teleportation, but I noticed that Paladin went into mana most of the time. I guess it makes sense since a Pacific Champion achieves something very similar and is half the cost. It was a difficult cut to make because winning off a clutch Paladin feels so good, but in reality, the situation didn't come up that often. Teleportation, I think, can achieve a similar outcome to Crystal Paladin in that it clears multiple blockers, which, paves the way for the weenies to attack. But it also has the added benefit of not needing an extra card to play. And Teleportation also works in more situations, like against other aggro decks, for example. So here's a nice bird's eye view of the deck. How it works is we try to summon creatures every turn. The deck is very intuitive since it's ideal to play most of the weenies on curve, except of course for Wily Carpenter. When playing this deck, I think there are 2 main pathways that we have to think about. One is to evolve the weenies as soon as possible, because the evolutions are difficult to remove. The other is to make sure most of your board can attack at a given time. So if it can be helped, there is merit in just attacking with weenies and deploying Spin Slicer and Pacific Champion as speed attackers on turn 3 or 4 or later. For example, turn 2 Vehicle, turn 3 Hulkus, turn 4 Time Scout plus Pacific Champion. The path taken will obviously depend on the cards drawn. This deck has a lot of evolutions, so there is a lot of variance in how games play out. But another key factor is knowledge of the opponent's deck. We have to think about if the opposing deck has a shield trigger that leads to the worst case scenario. For example, the evolutions don't really mind breaking into Aqua Surfer, but they do hate Soul Swap and Terrapit. On the flip side, multiple weenies are less bothered by this type of spot removal, but are very wary of Aqua Surfer and board wipes. We also don't have to charge every turn, but something to keep in mind is it's usually good to sit at 5 mana. A lot of strong plays become available at this point, for example, Wily Carpenter into Evolution, Speed Attacker Paladin, charge into Hardcast Aqua Surfer, charge into Hardcast Lucky Ball and a 2-drop. In terms of matchups, to be honest, I don't think this has the most impressive matchup spread out of the Season 3 decks. I think having the option to turn to Spin Slicer or Pacific was what made this deck crazy in the OCG. But I think it still has enough tools to work well. It's an aggro deck at heart, so it's theoretically able to rush down anything slower than itself. It also has a strong matchup against anything that can't deal with Pacific Champion or outspeed the deck. The deck struggles with pretty much anything else, anything that can effectively deal with Pacific Champion, or anything that runs tools it can't get around, like Pyro or Nariel. In terms of other options, Emerald is a great card that generally fits the deck. Being able to plant Surfer in shields and get a new card is a nice luxury to have. But we wanted to be able to highlight Pacific Champion, and that meant not having enough space for Emerald. Unicornfish is another great card we unfortunately couldn't make space for. I think the 4 cost is pretty good, and it perfectly fits the theme of the deck. Saucerhead Shark is kind of a board wipe that works well against decks that swarm. One of Water's biggest problems is not being good at dealing with large opposing boards. Saucerhead was occasionally used as a one-off in Mono Blue Pacific OCG decks, but I don't know, when we made this deck, we didn't have the space for it. I also think Teleportation's a bit better. And for the TCG loyalists, here's a version of the deck that uses cards from the first 12 sets. We've removed the Merfolk stuff to put in more, I guess, good stuff water cards like Emerald and Unicornfish. This is also our, I guess you could say it's our updated version of the Liquid People Beatdown deck we released in Season 1. I think cards like Lucky Ball make a little more sense than the whole T-Dad gimmick. We've also booted Coral for Unicornfish. The 1 mana cost makes a pretty big difference. And Aholia is, well, for additional plot armor, I guess. The second Paladin is needed without Pacific Champion, and as for Teleportation, I think there are a couple of different changes that you could play around with. Maybe you could drop one of the shield triggers, maybe you could drop the 4th Unicornfish, but I'm not too sure what I would change. But there you have it, Liquid People Beatdown, or I guess I should say Mono Water Rush. That's probably more appropriate since Pacific Champion is a key player in the deck. I hope you enjoyed this deck. This is a deck that I really enjoyed building. And, you know, Pacific Champion is a card that I just enjoy very much. As always, thank you for watching, stay safe, and we'll see you guys next time.